Good morning to one and all. In the previous class, we discussed about geosynthetics. In this geosynthetics, especially we discussed on these naturally occurring fibers, which will helps us for protecting these slopes and other different stabilization techniques. But in today's class, we have to discuss what are the different materials we have to utilize for the purpose of construction and stabilization purpose for the ground. Especially we need to focus on this naturally available material, that means crops. In our daily lives we are having so much bonds with these crops, so that one of the crop we are utilizing for the purpose of stabilization, we need to focus on those. First of all, how we have to utilize it means nowadays totally in our India we are having so much of bond with this agricultural, but in case of some of the foreign countries they are similar they are simply growing their economy with the help of industries and other tourisms and different activities. But in case of our India, the major development, that means the major products we are using is these agri products. After that we are having some quantities of industries, so that first of all we have to focus on these agri products, and we are having a plenty of water in some of those areas, so that we have to go for these crops for the purpose of stabilizations. First of all, we need to use different variants, that means variants of different crops for the purpose of this stabilization purpose. First of all, increase range of crops. We don't have to depend upon a single breed of the crop. We need to harvest a number of breeds, so that which one will gives a better results, we need to focus on those. Simply we are harvesting a one type of crop and it will not giving a yield, so that it will be waste of process and money, so that we need to grow a plenty of varieties of these crops, so that in those one we have to choose and we need to implement. First of all, farmers can cultivate and sell. That means simply it will be a useful techniques for the farmers. Why? Because in India we are having a plenty of varieties of food grains, so that in some of the cases these food grains will not give as much as price they require, so that in few cases there will be less quantity of water in those areas. We need to harvest these kind of crops, so that by those conditions farmers also will get some of the quantities of money with the cultivation of this kind of maize or rice crops. First of all, foreign can farmers can utilize this, and they have to sell these products, and new markets are primarily close to the product point. That means wherever we are harvesting these crops, so that according to those areas we need to include some of the points for selling purpose. Normally whenever we are having harvest areas of large quantities, in those particular large quantity of harvest areas we have to establish some of the selling points and buying points for farmers purpose and industry purpose. And next one is the money is attached to rural areas and rezone without including a major expenditure on transportation. Why? Because these kind of properties of materials will be majorly utilized in urbanized areas, but those crops will be produced in rural areas, so that there will be some change, that there will be some distance between those two agencies, rural agencies and grown agencies. We need to avoid the distance between those two agencies by these buying points and selling points, and we need to decrease the mode of transportation from farmers to these utilizers. Next, helps in bringing down a costly imports. That means whenever we are harvesting these, automatically there will be a need to users, so that the users will invest a quantity of money for farming purpose and selling purpose, so that they are also having some cash properties. And how we need to consolidate these techniques. First of all, we have to observe how to consolidate these kind of naturally occurring fibers. Similarly, we are having majorly two quantities of fibers: natural degrading fibers and non-degrading fibers. In this natural degrading fibers, we are having less quantity of time, and polymeric degrading materials having some high quantity of lifespan, and these quantities of natural fibers having less quantity of initial money, so that we have to choose in temporary structures and high strength structures. We need to choose these naturally occurring polymers. Since from 1930, these sand drains are used in various projects. Normally sand drains, it is the philosophy of dewatering technique. In different areas where we have to face this water effect in the ground itself, and those water will having a tendency to collapse the total foundation. And due to those kind of total collapse foundation, we have to use some of these consolidation techniques. In those, this the sand drains is having some importance. In 1930s, these sand drains were introduced, and those are also utilized in various kinds of project, not only a single project like dams or any other. In a different projects like dams, embankments, and these bridges and roads, likely they are having different projects. In all those projects, these sand drains are utilized, and they are having a typically 200 to 600 mm. That means simply 20 to 60 centimeters diameter, and vertical drains are spaced between 1.5 to 6 meters interval. 1.5 meters means simply a 5 feet. 6 meters means typically a 20 feet. So that for each sand drain we are maintaining a minimum diameter of 200 mm. That means 200 mm means simply a 20 centimeter below 1 feet, and 600 mm means simply a 2 feet diameter of this sand drain. And the distance between those points also we are having some importance. For each sand column we are having to maintain a distance of 1.5 meter spacing or center to center between two columns, and a maximum distance we have to maintain is 6 meters interval. All those conditions we have to observe in the top view of a structure, and we have to construct the cross section and top view for the particular diagram. The conventional vertical sand drains technique is time consuming and very costly, and availability of a good quantity of sand become scarcity in current years. Why? Because nowadays we are obtaining a less quantity of sand. Like sands also we are having different grades: class A, class B, class C, and class D. So that due to this scarcity in the sand, major projects are not constructing these sand drains in their projects, and they are simply going for utilization of different polymeric materials and different these polymers. So that in the place of this sand drains and piles, simply they are using this PVDs, prefabricated vertical drains. PVD means, so that the sand drains also having a replacement facilities with these PVDs. In current years, due to the scarcity of the sand, major projects are not utilizing this sand as for the construction of these columns, stand columns. It is the typical diagram we have to observe. The total embankment is lies above the ground level. Below the embankment, that means below the ground level, we are having totally 4 circular columns. The circular columns simply we have it called as a sand drains. In each sand drains, the diameter will be varies from 200 mm to 600 mm, and spacing will be varies from 1.5 meters to 5 meters. 6 meters. Okay, this is the typical arrangement of the sand drain. We have to observe the embankment is totally constructed in the shape of a trapezium. The total trapezium is lies above the ground level. We are having a markings. Central level we are having a long line. On the each side of that means LHS side and RHS side we are having markings. Those markings simply represents this arrangement of ground level. Below the ground level we are having sand drains. Above the ground level we are having this embankment fill, and their diameters and their distances we have to note down. After that we are having these PVDs, prefabricated vertical drains. Those are the now recent advancement to the sand columns. In olden days they are having plenty amount of resources. By utilizing their resources they are constructed a large scale projects. In those large scale projects also they are having huge quantities of lifespan because of less content of these impurities present in those time periods. Nowadays we are having, due to this huge amount of industrialization and urbanization and population, the total materials will be spoiled and having too much of impurities, so that due to those too much of impurities, those are not able to give such quantities of strength. For that purpose we are utilizing different quantities of hybrid materials. One quantity of material will be associated with the another quantity of materials. Those two materials are giving huge amount of strength compared to a normal material. Likely here we are using this prefabricated vertical drains in the replacement of sand drains. For particularly recently prefabricated vertical drains, here they are mentioned a band drains are replacing the sand drains and sand columns. Compared to this sand drain, the polymer based prefabricated vertical drain is 100 mm in width and 3 to 5 mm in thickness. So that what we have to observe is for each sand column we are having a minimum width of 200 mm and a maximum width of 600 mm, and center to center spacing is also 1.5 to 6 meters. But in case of this PPVDs, means polymer based prefabricated vertical drains, are also having a minimum distance of 100 mm width and 3 to 5 mm in thickness. The 100 mm width is simply the diameter of the sand pipe, that means pipe hole, and this thickness is simply the material dimension, that means length breadth they are having, and thickness is simply 5 mm, 3 to 5 mm, minimum is 3 mm and maximum is 5 mm they are utilizing. So that by the utilization of these PPVDs they are having some effective principles. These principles will give a good quantities of results when compared to this previously used sand drains and other sand columns. So in lot of projects simply they are preferring these kinds of constructions. Why? Because those are simply time saving and cost effective structures. So compared to this sand drains and sand columns, they are preferring these prefabricated vertical drains. And what are the advantages compared to these sand columns? First of all, we are having this prefabricated vertical drains having many advantages with respect to these sand drains, and the band shaped prefabricated vertical drains are easy to install in the soil, as well as causes least disturbance to the soil during installation. Normally whenever we are going to construct a sand column, we need to dig preliminary a borehole. After the digging of boreholes, we need to inject some quantity of sand and we need to vibrate to avoid particular content of voids in the column. After that we have to go for this arrangement, so that it is a simply time consuming process, and due to this digging of earth surfaces below the ground level, they will cause some quantities of disturbance to the surrounding particles of the earth, and those conditions also very severe in some of the cases. But here what we are doing is simply a small quantity of distance we are simply digging, and in those distances they are going for installation of this polymeric prefabricated vertical drains PPVDs, so that there will be less disturbance and less quantity of consumption of materials. And the discharge capacity of band drain is more, and consolidation rate is high than the sand drain. Normally discharge capacity means the content of water will be drawn from a particular surface of the ground will be very high in these PVDs. Normally in the sand drains we are collecting the water content, but in these PVD conditions we are getting more quantity of water. Discharge is very high compared to these normal sand drains, so that we have there is some advantageous points in these two aspects. So first of all, the consumption of material is very less, and the disturbance to the soil is also very less, and this discharge quantity is very high. These three are the major advantages compared to the normal sand drain with respect to these prefabricated vertical drains. Higher than the sand drains, and it is also decreases the required surcharge of the compression of the soil. That means the compression means whenever we are installing these sand drains, automatically we have to apply some quantity of pressure to decrease the content of voids in between the sand layers. But here what we are doing is simply we are injecting this layer into the soil level, so that the total layer is capable to draw a quantity of water from the soil and giving a good strength to the structure. It is the advantage. And here we have to observe a typical arrangement and a geosynthetic embankment with prefer prefabricated vertical drains. Here PVDs means prefabricated vertical drains. Generally we have to observe the spacing between the her columns and the total embankment, and here we are having some geosynthetic layers between this embankment and substructure. Geosynthetic embankment is prefabricated with vertical drains, and those are spaced at a distance of 1 meter to 2 meter side by side. On the above structure we are having both drainage on two sides and geosynthetic layer. Why? Because if the drainage is simply leave alike, that means leave alike, automatically those water will be absorbed by the surrounding soil conditions, and the total process will be loosened. To control those loosened status, we have to utilize these geosynthetic layers. And what is the major outline of this particular project is properties of marine clay and natural prefabricated vertical drains, and filtration characteristics of jute and polymer geotechnical filter. First of all, we have to observe these two conditions. Marine clay, that means clay is associated with the areas of salt, that means sea, coastal areas. Those areas simply we will call it as the marine clays. Normally in marine areas we have to face huge quantities of sand, but whenever we are having huge amount of deposition of this clay matter near the sand, in those areas we have to observe these marine clays. Those marine clays are simply associated with the help of these natural PVDs, that means natural prefabricated vertical drains, and the filtration characteristics of the jute and polymer geotextile filter. First of all, here we have to observe the embankment color, and the bottom of the ground level we are having these PVDs. On the both sides we are having this drainage of water from these PVD lines. In the second diagram also we are having this storage tank, and the bottom we are having soft soil with the help of these PVDs, and after the above the PVDs we are having this sand geotextile. Those are simply represented with the color of red color. We have to observe sand, geotextile and prefabricated vertical drains, and this is soft soil arrangement. And how those materials are simply installed in the structure of the soil. First of all, we are having two conditions. First one is the filter and second one is the core. These two are having major responsible for carrying water from the ground to top level. First of all, the major duty of this filter is to avoid this coming of these clay particles and sand particles into the structure, and it will simply allows water content into the structure, and core having this capillary rise from bottom to top, so that core will absorb and this transfers the water from bottom of the structure to top structure. So this is the total arrangement of this prefabricated vertical drains in the site itself. First we are having embankment, and the second structure we are having this storage tank. In which areas we have to utilize these concepts, particularly this prefabricated vertical drain. First of all, it should be employable to highways. Why? Because in the highways we have to face major quantities of these uprises. Why? Because the highways are having huge amount of lengths, that means thousands of kilometers they have to construct. While we are constructing those thousands of kilometers of lengths, we have to face a lot of structures. That means canals we have to face. In some of the areas we have to observe drainage conditions and different rivers, and in some of the areas we have to face these subseas, and different problems we have to face while we are constructing a national highway or highway structures. Definitely in those areas we have to apply this kind of prefabricated vertical drains whenever we are having these loose sands. Why? Because the total highway is to have some quantity of strengthened material. If the total structure is very weak and it is not suitable for construction, automatically those structure is not able to take the entire loads which are coming from the movement of vehicles. Whenever the load is simply changing, automatically the road having a less quantity of lifespan, and it needs a rehabilitation techniques for every 6 to 1, that means 6 months to 1 year period. They need to have some proper thickness of road. That means they have to lay a thickness of road as a coatings, so that we have to implement these geosynthetic materials and some of the ground improvement techniques below the structures of these highways. And the second content is these airways. Why we are focusing on these airways means, normally in the structures of airways we have to observe the total mass of the aeroplane is very high compared to the normal vehicle, so that it have to reach to a higher levels from the ground level, so that it need to focus on few points of the ground. After that it have to move from the ground to this sky. Similarly, the total aircraft, that means aeroplane, need to land on the surface of the ground, so that whenever the total mass of the aeroplane is reaching from one strata to another strata, the huge applications, it means load applications, will be transferred from the wheels of the aeroplane to these ground levels. In those conditions also there may be some disturbance in the substrata and the top layers of the earth surface whenever we are having these road systems. That means definitely we are utilizing these bt roads. In some of the cases we are using normal city roads, so that due to this huge application of this vehicular wheel loads, automatically top surface will be eroded in some areas. So that those areas we need to have some large setups, especially these runways. And in the airport itself, the people have to move from a long length periods by using these taxiways. And in some of the airports, they are simply utilizing these aeroplanes for the purpose of movement of these cargos. Cargo means normally these materials we have to transport from our country to another country, or we need to borrow from another country to our country, like medicines and other emergency goods. In the recent periods of time, we have observed our India is simply transferring some of the medicinals, it means medicines, to another countries. Likely we have to transfer and we need to borrow from other sources of countries, so that there may be some need of cargo also. Aeroplanes are simply using for this purpose also, so that there may be some need to the airports for the purpose of improvement of ground. Simply need to have some of these techniques to improve their substructure and top structural data. After that, we are having earth dams. Why? Because earth dams, they are having a tendency to store the water. Whenever earth dam having a tendency to store the water, automatically those water having some seepage properties to the bottom of the structure. Due to those seepage also, there may be some structural change. It means normally in the previous cases, the total structure is in dry condition. Whenever we are utilizing those fields for the purpose of earth dams, normally earth dam means the total dam will be constructed with the help of earth material, like soil. The total soil is compacted with the help of huge equipments and machinery, so that the total soil will be acting as a barrier, and those will protect the uh, water movement. And we need to divert those water whenever we are having a need to that. So that earth dams also having some huge quantities of foundations. These foundations also have to face disturbances whenever there will be a movement of water, or huge amount of this movement of water, so that those water we have to remove by this help of this dewatering techniques, especially sand drains. But in this particular topic, we are utilizing these polymeric materials, polymers, for the purpose of removal of water. Prefabricated vertical drains in the form of sand drains we are utilizing, so that those topic is also essential in the fields of earth dams. And next one is the embankments and leaves. Normally embankments, where we have to observe these embankments, is whenever we are having a medium of transportation. That means we have to move from one place to another place with some change of altitude. That means the ground level is somewhat low compared to another area, so that we need to level those two conditions. I will show with an example. We are having a particular area, and here we are having a particular area. The distance between these two areas we have to connect with these kind of embankments, so that here we have to utilize the total matter in the form of this filling of materials, that is called as an embankment. In those embankment also, we have to go for some densification methods and different compaction techniques. Why? Because the structure of this embankment is using for the purpose of transportation here also, so that transportation and simply movement of different vehicles or any other goods, so that whenever we are using those purposes, automatically the soil having a tendency of erosion and this leaching due to this wind force and water, so that we have to control those two conditions by implementing these soil drains and prefabricated vertical drains. Next one is storage tank. storage tanks. In our recent city culture, we have to observe for every 1000 to 10,000 families, we are having a separate storage tanks in our areas. Normally the storage have tanks have to store a particular quantity of water, and they need to distribute on a specific period of time. For suppose, in our normally in the morning period, we have to observe the total families are simply storing water by the help of these motors. Okay, these storage tanks also have to construct in a large heights. Why? Because if the total families are very high, that means the total covered area will be very high. Automatically those tank have to be stay on very heights to cover those all areas. Simply they need to transfer the water from starting home to end home. They need to have some heights, so that whenever we are constructing a structure with some quantity of height, so that due to those bearing capacity of the soil, and we need to observe some of the structural data. Why? Because the structure is in a very high height position. At that particular height, we are having a different loads, like dead load, live load, wind load, and some other static loads are acting on the structure. We need to eliminate those different loads by constructing a large foundation to these tanks. So that we have to focus on these geosynthetics and some of the techniques. Why? Because the total structure will not be sink at a particular position. To control all those things, we need to utilize this geosynthetics at basements, and we need to use these sand drains and these PVDs. After that, we are having excavations. Excavations means steepen or allowable slopes. These excavations, normally we have to utilize this kind of excavations whenever we are having these hilly areas or pilgrimages. Especially in those areas, we have to do excavations for transporting purpose. In those also we have to do this sand drains and PVDs. Why? Because the total vehicles are simply moving from large heights to small heights. At those places, simply there may be stagnant of water. Automatically the bottom structure will have to be fall, so that for the purpose of enrichment the strength of these slopy areas, they have to use these PVDs, and they need to transfer the water from top level to bottom level. After that, we are having these waste ponds and main tiling ponds. Normally waste ponds means for every village or a city, there may be some waste ponds they need to maintain. Why? Because in nowadays we have to observe the total Hyderabad city is simply under water conditions. Why? Because there may be no some reservoirs. That means there may be there no quantity of some of the ponds. If there is a pond, automatically the total water which is comes from this rain, automatically those total water will be stored in these waste ponds or waste lands. If there is no proper facility for the collection of the water, automatically the water have to be transferred into the homes, or whenever there is a slopy area, the total water will be staggered on those particular slopy areas. To control those kind of things, we have to maintain some previous data, and we need to collect, and we have to maintain these waste ponds and main tailing ponds. That means main tailing ponds means we need to connect one pond with another pond for maintaining equilibrium position in all tanks. Next one is the some of the important buildings we have to observe. That means if there is a hospital, that means government hospitals, and some of the huge quantities of temples, depending upon their star values. Means if the total number of people who are visiting is very high, then the buildings are having some importance factor. Likely we have to observe the important structures in those areas, and we need to maintain all these facilities. Like industrial plants, in the industries there may be some thousands of workers are simply working in those areas also there will be no settlements and no failures to the structure. And next one is the warehouses and wastewater treatment plants. Warehouses means some storage purpose we are using these warehouses, and wastewater treatment plants. For every city we have to maintain some wastewater treatment plants, otherwise the total city have to face some drainage problems and severe smells and diseases they are spreading. So that these wastewater treatment plants also having some importance. Next one, apartments. Nowadays this apartment culture is simply going. Why? Because due to the scarcity of lands in the cities, simply they are constructing apartment. Why? Because in the olden days there may be some less population and they need some small houses, but nowadays the simply population is simply growing and there may be some less space due to the huge amount of growth of population and less quantity of area. They are going in y direction, that means the total houses will be growing in y direction. Why? Because in the x direction there is no possibility of growing. Why? Means for every people, that means for every quantity of people they need some quantity of land for farming and land for these facilities like parks and structures and some of the hotels. So that we need to choose all those things, after that we have to elaborate, so that there may be some importance to these apartments in nowadays. And next one, shopping centers. These are also explained previously. For every particular quantity of people there may be need of the some of the public facilities like hotels, shopping malls and different needs. So that in those particular areas we have to establish this kind of PVDs and sand drains, and we have to go for some ground improvement techniques to ensure the safety of the structure. And what are the different geosynthetic materials we are using? India is in our India mostly we are using these natural materials like jute and coir. Why? Because our India having huge amount of land for farming purpose, so that those materials we have to farm and we need to obtain those materials in a cheap cost and very low prices. And those materials are very eco-friendly. They do not cause any harm to the environment, so that those are simply eco-friendly and they are very hygroscopic. They will absorb huge amount of water and they will transfer. And next, indigenous and economical when availability is abundantly. Whenever the crops are very huge, automatically the availability of the source also very high. We are having the plenty quantities of water resources and other resources in some of the seasons, so that especially in those seasons we need to get this quantity of materials will in high manner. Next one, aims and objectives for present studies. It means in the particular topic we are discussing the totally about the importance of these geosynthetic materials and their utilizations. But what is our main aim? To study some of the major properties of this tensile strength and discharge capacity of NPVDs, that means naturally occurring prefabricated vertical drains and soil retention ability and clogging potential and natural geotextile filters, materials which are essential to sustain the efficiency and unity. What we have to learn from this particular chapter is different properties like tensile properties and strength properties of these polymeric materials which we are using for the purpose of vertical drains, and we have to go for different naturally occurring poly vertical drains and soil retention ability. That means normally what is the soil retention ability for a period that means for a structure, and if we are using these quantities of materials, what is the soil retention ability, those we have to correlate. and with the properties of these clogging potentials and natural and geotextiles filter materials which are essential. And next one we have to compare different specifics, that means specific properties we have to observe for every material and their properties and values. To test that material and the strength, we need to have some caudal provisions, and we have to follow those. For particularly these properties of structures, we are having these Indian standard provisions. Indian standard 2720 parts we are having, part 1 to part 15 we are having. In those, for every property we have to observe what is the specific gravity, liquid limit, plastic limit, shrinkage limit, plasticity index, silt content and clay content, and compression index, swelling index. All those are the properties of a soil. Whenever we are using these materials, is there any variation in those values, we have to observe, and we need to go for comparison. And this geosynthetics engineering having different applications of these materials, and those are natural prefabricated vertical drains, NPVDs, and polyethylene prefabricated vertical drains. That means naturally means those are simply available from the nature, and PPVDs means this polyethylene prefabricated vertical drains. In that particular figure we are having totally a 5 types of materials. The first one is the synthetic material, and the remaining 4 are the NPVD. That means those are naturally occurring materials. We have to observe PPVD means prefabricated prefabricated vertical drain, and NPVD means naturally prefabricated vertical drain 1 2 3 4. Likely we are having a arrangement of 4 conditions. By using those, simply we need to observe the content of water will be logged from the structure. Like jute and coir, majorly we are harvesting, and from those two materials we are tracing these 4 tendencies of materials and their values and their filtering capacities and curves and their width, that means the particle size and the minimum thickness. All those are mentioned here. First one, NPV, naturally occurring prefabricated vertical drains 1 2 3 4, totally 4 we are having, and PPVDs, their width and their core means the diameter. Normally diameter means the individual particle we have to observe, and for the individual particle what is the diameter. Here they specifically they mentioned that core means for every PVD, that means vertical drain we have to maintain some depth, means diameter we have to maintain. In the previous cases NPVD fan drains were having 200 to 600 diameter of the drain, but in case of these NPVDs they are simply maintaining a 200 wide. And these are the different properties of the filter cores, filter type and core type we are having. According to ASTM, means American standards for testing of materials, they are giving some woven jute, non-woven jute, and non-woven polypropylene jute. These are also some physical properties and comparison of these normal materials and these physical properties of the materials. And here the test properties, that means some of the densities and weight per meter, means normally simply gravity and tensile strength variation from normal to NPVD and PPVD, and elongation of the particular material at particular break distances and tensile strengths, all those are given here. There may be some standard deviation coefficients for different materials: woven jutes, non-woven jutes, core standards, float coir mats, and corrugated coir mats. These are the different materials. They are having some importance in their utilization fields. At our final, what we have to discuss is all the natural occurring materials. That means NPVDs have adequate tensile strength to resist the tensile force of 1 kilonewton at a tensile strain of 10%, and the highest average maximum tensile strength is obtained in NPVD 1, while the lowest in NPVD 2. Okay, today's class is over.